Let me begin with a simple but sobering thought. In economics, power is never absolute. You can shout, threaten, or impose tariffs, but if the underlying structures of production and finance have shifted, then no matter how powerful you think you are, the world will quietly rearrange itself beyond your control. And that, in essence, is what's happening with Donald Trump's ongoing belief that he holds economic leverage over China. It's a story not of dominance, but of delusion, one born from misunderstanding how global capitalism has evolved over the last 40 years. It's one of the greatest ironies of our time. The very system that made America the global superpower is the same system that quietly handed much of its manufacturing leverage to China. The relationship between the U.S. and China didn't shift overnight. It was decades in the making, built on decisions made in corporate boardrooms, not in Beijing. When Donald Trump speaks about putting America first and confronting China, he's not just fighting a foreign adversary, he's wrestling with the consequences of American capitalism itself. And that is a battle he cannot win with tariffs or slogans. Let's go back to the 1980s and 1990s. U.S. corporations were under pressure to boost profits, satisfy shareholders, and compete in a world increasingly open to global trade. The answer they found was not innovation at home, not investment in American workers, but outsourcing, the systematic relocation of production to countries where labor was cheaper and regulations weaker. China, with its enormous workforce and open door policy for foreign investment, became the perfect destination. American corporations didn't just buy Chinese goods, they built Chinese factories, trained Chinese workers, and transferred technology that would over time transform China into the world's industrial engine. It was not China stealing America's jobs, it was American companies sending them away deliberately, methodically, and profitably. That's the paradox Trump refuses to acknowledge when he talks about punishing China for unfair trade practices. He's really threatening the very corporations that funded his campaigns and defined the modern U.S. economy. Apple, Nike, General Motors, Boeing, these are not Chinese firms, yet they rely heavily on Chinese manufacturing, Chinese labor, and Chinese markets. In other words, America's corporate giants have made themselves deeply dependent on the same country Trump claims to dominate. How then can you pressure your own partner without hurting yourself? That's not leverage, that's economic self-sabotage. Consider the modern supply chain, a web so intricate that no single nation controls it anymore. A product labeled made in China may contain components designed in California, raw materials from Africa, software from India, and capital from Wall Street. Trump's tariff wars tried to disrupt that web, but what happened? American consumers paid higher prices, companies lost profits, and inflation surged. Meanwhile, Chinese firms adapted, diversified their markets, and continued to grow. The idea that America could strong-arm China economically was not just naive, it was outdated thinking in a world where production and profit transcend national borders. Here's the hook that rarely gets discussed in mainstream media. America's economic elite didn't just outsource jobs, they outsourced power. Every time a U.S. corporation shifted its operations to China, it handed Beijing a piece of strategic influence. Today, that influence shows up in ways that go far beyond trade, in control over critical materials, supply chain logistics, and even digital infrastructure. And when Trump talks about bringing jobs back, he's talking about reversing decisions made by private corporations driven by one motive: profit. Yet, under capitalism, profit comes before patriotism. That's the contradiction at the heart of Trump's rhetoric. It's also crucial to understand how deeply cultural and financial this dependency has become. Wall Street investors poured billions into Chinese markets because they saw growth opportunities that no longer existed in America's stagnating industrial base. American consumers, in turn, came to rely on cheap Chinese goods to sustain their standard of living. So when Trump tries to frame China as an economic enemy, he's missing the deeper truth. The U.S. economy is structurally entangled with China's. The two nations are not opponents in a boxing ring. They're business partners chained together in a global supply system designed by capitalism itself. So when Trump stands at a podium and claims he can pressure China to bend to America's will, it plays well to the crowd, but it betrays an economic ignorance. The leverage he imagines is long gone, traded away by decades of profit, chasing policies that favored corporate gain over national independence. The American working class lost its factories, its bargaining power, and its economic security, not because of China's aggression, but because of decisions made in Washington and Wall Street. And no amount of patriotic rhetoric can hide that uncomfortable truth. The most powerful lesson here is one that Trump and his advisors seem unwilling to face. You cannot reclaim leverage in a globalized economy by shouting across oceans. Real leverage comes from production, from a nation's ability to make what it consumes, and from the independence that flows from economic strength. But when you've spent 40 years dismantling your industrial base, replacing workers with imports, and prioritizing profits over people, leverage becomes a memory, a ghost of the past America once knew. And as much as Trump likes to project power, history reminds us the louder a leader insists he holds all the cards, the more likely it is that the deck has already been dealt against him. When we talk about leverage in global economics, we're really talking about control: who controls the resources, the supply chains, and the financial instruments that make modern economies function. And when you look closely, it becomes evident that the balance of control has shifted far more than many in Washington care to admit. Donald Trump's repeated insistence that America holds leverage over China overlooks an uncomfortable fact. China has quietly built an arsenal of structural and financial power that now gives it significant influence over the U.S. economy itself. The notion that the United States can simply pressure China is not just an exaggeration, it's a misunderstanding of how deeply intertwined and in many ways inverted the power relationship has become. Let's begin with something that should make every American policymaker pause: debt. The United States runs on borrowing. Its government spends far more than it collects, financing the gap by issuing treasury bonds bought by investors around the world. And one of the largest buyers of that debt for many years has been China. When the U.S. government borrows, a portion of that borrowing is financed by Chinese capital. In essence, China lends America the money it uses to maintain its operations, its military, and even its domestic programs. That's not a position of dominance, that's dependency disguised as stability. If China were to ever reduce its purchases of U.S. debt significantly or diversify too aggressively away from the dollar, it could send shockwaves through global markets, and Washington knows it. That's real leverage, the kind that doesn't need to be shouted from podiums because it's built into the structure of global finance itself. Beyond debt, consider production and materials, China doesn't just manufacture finished goods, it controls key inputs that make the global economy run. Rare earth elements, for example, vital for everything from smartphones and electric vehicles to advanced weapon systems, are dominated by Chinese mining and refining capacity. The U.S. can't simply snap its fingers and produce those resources at home. It takes years of investment, technology, and infrastructure to build those capabilities. That means that even the most America First manufacturing initiatives still depend on materials that originate in China's industrial ecosystem. In short, you can't isolate yourself from the country that makes the world's production possible. What makes this situation even more striking is that China's rise has been strategic, not accidental. While Washington spent decades deregulating markets and allowing industries to chase short-term profits, Beijing was pursuing long-term national planning. They didn't just open their markets, they built a vision, investing heavily in infrastructure, education, and technology. Today, China leads in sectors that define the future: green energy, electric vehicles, high-speed rail, and 5G networks. Meanwhile, the U.S. is still debating how to rebuild its crumbling bridges and public systems. When Trump threatens China with tariffs, he's trying to fight a 21st century competitor with 20th century tools. It's like bringing a sword to a digital war. Here's the hook that too many politicians miss: economic leverage in today's world isn't about who produces the most rhetoric. It's about who controls the choke points. China has spent the last 2 decades quietly building control over the critical nodes of global supply, from electronics assembly and battery production to solar panels and pharmaceuticals. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Americans learned just how dependent they were when medical equipment and drug supplies were suddenly delayed. Those supply chain vulnerabilities weren't created by China's aggression, they were exposed by America's complacency. That's the harsh truth behind the illusion of leverage. And if we look at global trade alliances, the picture becomes even more complicated for Washington. China has deepened its economic ties with regions across Asia, Africa, and Latin America through investments and infrastructure projects. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't just a geopolitical play, it's a reorganization of global commerce that reduces China's reliance on Western markets and increases its influence across the developing world. Meanwhile, U.S. influence in those same regions has waned, not because of military weakness, but because of economic neglect. The world is increasingly trading in yuan, signing bilateral deals that bypass the dollar, and joining Chinese-led institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Every one of those developments erodes America's traditional advantage, its control over global finance. The problem for Trump is that he's trying to use leverage that doesn't exist anymore. Tariffs, threats, and political grandstanding may play well on the campaign trail, but they don't change the math of interdependence. For every American company that pulls out of China, dozens more still rely on Chinese production because it's efficient, established, and profitable. For every product Trump wants to reshore, there are hundreds of components that still come from factories in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Suzhou. The global economy isn't a contest of wills, it's a web of obligations. And in that web, China has become the spider sitting at the center, not the fly caught in someone else's trap. So when Trump claims he can pressure China, the real story is that the U.S. has already ceded much of its economic leverage, not through weakness, but through design. China's structural power is a mirror reflecting decades of U.S. policy choices, offshoring, deregulation, and financialization. The leverage has shifted, and no amount of political theater can disguise the fact that the world's balance of power now runs through Beijing as much as it once did through Washington. The quiet truth is that China doesn't need to shout to demonstrate power. In the global economy of the 21st century, control isn't about confrontation, it's about connection. And that's the kind of leverage Trump never learned to see. When Donald Trump insists that America's struggles stem from China's unfair trade practices, he's missing a deeper and more uncomfortable truth. The core of America's economic challenge lies not in Beijing, but in itself. The United States' diminishing leverage over China is not simply a geopolitical shift. It's the direct consequence of decades of internal decay, policy neglect, and the triumph of short-term profit over long-term prosperity. You cannot rebuild power abroad when the foundation at home is crumbling, and yet that's exactly the contradiction Washington continues to ignore. For decades, both political parties sold the same dream: that free markets would make everyone richer, that globalization would lift all boats, and that corporate success would translate into national strength. But in practice, that dream became a nightmare for millions of working Americans. Factories closed, towns hollowed out, and entire communities lost the dignity that comes from meaningful work. The corporations that once formed the backbone of American manufacturing left for cheaper labor in China and elsewhere. They didn't do it because China forced them. They did it because Wall Street demanded higher profits, faster returns, and endless growth. That's not China's manipulation. That's capitalism's design. Trump, to his credit, sensed the anger this system created. He saw the pain of American workers who had been forgotten and promised to bring jobs back. But his diagnosis was wrong. He treated the symptom, not the disease. The disease was never China's ambition. It was America's abandonment of its own people in favor of corporate greed. So when Trump imposed tariffs, all he really did was raise prices for the very workers he claimed to protect without changing the system that drove those jobs overseas in the first place. The irony is striking. The man who promised to fight for the working class ended up deepening their dependence on the same corporate model that betrayed them. Here's the hook that every American needs to hear: you can't regain economic power with speeches and slogans. You regain it through structure and substance. The real leverage of a nation doesn't come from how loudly its leaders speak, but from how strong its economy truly is, from its ability to produce, to innovate, and to sustain its people. And in that sense, the U.S. has been bleeding leverage for decades. Infrastructure has aged, education has been underfunded, public health has deteriorated, and inequality has soared. The wealth of the nation has been siphoned to the top, while the working class has been told to settle for gig work, credit card debt, and fading dreams of security. That's not leverage, that's fragility disguised as confidence. Meanwhile, China has been doing what the U.S. once did best, investing in its people, its industries, and its future. While America debates whether healthcare is a right or a privilege, China is building entire cities, high-speed rail networks, and a workforce equipped for the industries of tomorrow. It's not that China is perfect, far from it, but it has direction, strategy, and purpose. qualities that America seems to have traded for quarterly profits and political polarization. The contrast couldn't be clearer. While China plans in decades, America plans in election cycles. You can't outmaneuver a system that thinks in centuries by one that thinks in sound bites. The tragedy of Trump's rhetoric is that it offers a comforting villain instead of a constructive vision. Blaming China feels satisfying because it gives Americans someone to hold responsible. But the true culprits are the domestic elites who sold out the nation's productive capacity for shareholder value. They offshored the factories, lobbied for deregulation, and turned the American dream into a global profit machine. Trump's tariffs couldn't change that because the rot wasn't in trade, it was in the structure of American capitalism itself. If the U.S. truly wants leverage again, it must rebuild it from within. That means investing in education, infrastructure, technology, and social stability, not because it's politically convenient, but because that's where real economic power is born. Leverage is not the ability to threaten others, it's the capacity to stand independently. You can't command respect in the world when your own workers are struggling to pay rent, when your roads and bridges are crumbling, and when your political system can't even agree on the basics of governance. The uncomfortable truth is that America's decline in leverage mirrors its decline in unity and vision. Once upon a time, the United States built its strength through collective effort, through industrial policy, public investment, and a belief that prosperity should be shared. That spirit has been replaced by a culture of extraction where the few profit while the many endure. And so when Trump declares that America can win against China, the question isn't whether China can be beaten, it's whether America can rediscover what once made it strong: solidarity, foresight, and the will to build rather than blame. Until that happens, no tariff, no speech, and no threat will restore the leverage Trump imagines he holds. Real strength doesn't come from confrontation, it comes from construction. And in the long run, history doesn't reward the loudest leader, it rewards the nation wise enough to rebuild itself before it's too late.